Support for this podcast comes from the Phil Smith Center for Free Enterprise at the FAU College of Business. The Phil Smith Center for Free Enterprise supports the vision and strategic plan of the College of Business to advance thought leadership in business. The center supports chaired professorships and research, educational programs for faculty members and students, distinguished visiting faculty, along with a lecture series and other educational programs focused on the principles of free enterprise and how those principles affect growth and prosperity. Learn more at business.fau.edu/Phil Smith.
Hello, I'm Dan Gropper, Dean of the Florida Atlantic University College of Business. Today is a special day at Florida Atlantic University, and I'm here with Professor Siri Turgeson, the Dean's Distinguished Professor of Entrepreneurship, and our special guest, 2002 Nobel Laureate in Economics, Dr. Vernon Smith. And Dr. Smith is a distinguished chair, the Argyros Chair at Chapman University, and he and his wife Candace are here doing various things with the business school, and he's just finished lecturing to a Principles of Economics class. And so we'd like to welcome Dr. Smith to the Dean's podcast. So welcome, Vernon.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you very much. As we've discussed, Florida Atlantic University is a very diverse university, one of the most diverse in the country, and ranked very highly by U.S. News & World Report for upward mobility. That is to say, for helping students from modest backgrounds do particularly well in the workforce and then improve their lot in life. And in fact, we're one of the areas where we excel is serving first-generation students. And if I'm not mistaken, you were a first-generation in your family college student yourself. Isn't that right, Vernon?
Yes, I was. Yes, and I had a great uncle who had injured his leg on a farm gate, and so he wasn't able to work like other boys on the farm. So he got an education, taught school, and got a law degree from the University of Kansas. So that was my grandfather's brother. You see, so it was not, I never knew him very well. I'd met him. So I was a first generation. And it created a problem when I had to decide how to pick a college. You know, how do you choose a college? You usually go to someone who's in your family, that's kind of experienced.
And no one could do that. But you shared with our students a little bit about some of the jobs you'd had as a teenager. Would you mind sharing that with our podcast audience?
Well, yes. In my time, I grew up in the 1930s and 40s. My parents were not that well off, especially at that time, because it was a difficult time for everyone. And so I didn't have any spending money unless I worked. So my first job was delivering for a local drugstore on my bicycle, and I was 12 years old. And so I got 50 cents for 6 hours work. But actually, you see, hamburger was 5 cents a pound, to give you an idea. You see, and if you bought a hamburger from a hamburger place, that was 5 cents. So that was my starting job, and it was I loved it. I just I tell you what I liked about it is I felt I was doing something important for my employer. I had this sense, that if Mrs. Blackburn, who owned this drugstore, she was trying out different things to try to, improve the business. And she had this idea of delivering, you see, and also having a curb hop service from the fountain. She tried that for a while. And so So I worked for her for 2 years, and I learned between deliveries, I learned to operate an old-fashioned drugstore fountain, make sodas and sundaes and milkshakes and malts. That was the
floats and that sort of thing.
Floats, all root beer floats, root beer Frosties. It's just either the ice cream's floating or it's mixed up in the root beer. And so you learn to make all those drinks. And so when I got another job offer at a drive-in. They wanted someone to manage the fountain. And I was 14 years old. I didn't cost very much.
Nice. Nice. And your experience.
And so now I'm getting $1 a day.
Ooh.
And I got a raise there to, I think it was $8 for a 5-day week.
Amazing.
So that's the way you kind of progressed. And then Wichita was the home of Boeing, or the second home of Boeing. It's the home of, we built the B-29 bomber in Boeing. And so when they started hiring, I went to work for Boeing. I was 16 years old, 16 and a half. And so, wow, I was working the night shift and I was making 75 cents an hour.
Wow.
I mean, it was like a fortune, $5.40 a day. And living at home, you save it all. So I was ready when I went to college. I already had some money saved for it. So it was I look back with great pleasure on those days, and the feeling that already by the time I was 16, I really felt I was kind of an adult, that I could do things, you see, and because you see, actually working at these jobs is different than going to school. You're out there, you see, among all kinds of people that are themselves not necessarily educated. And I think it's a great experience for anyone to have, even if they are mainly bent on college.
Yeah. I think it's always fascinating to me when I have guests on here. I often like to ask them about their first jobs. And one of the things, I'll ask Siri this in a minute, but I'll also share that I had some experience working on a tree farm, Christmas tree farm, pruning Christmas trees and then harvesting them in the winter when I was in high school. And then I had a regular job. It wasn't just seasonal, but it was a 2 days a week job working in a local pizza oven. So you'd make the pizzas, you'd make the sub sandwiches, but you learned about interacting with the public, taking people's orders, making sure they were happy with them, dealing with complaints, and that sort of thing. And the point about some of those entry-level jobs is just even developing those kind of habits that you can be relied on to show up to work when you're scheduled to work and you'll do a good job is actually a pretty significant skill that sometimes is overlooked, that you really need to have, then sort of learn that ability to listen to your supervisor and take direction and do what needs to be done and handle customers, that sort of thing. Siri, what was your first job that you can share with us here, if you don't mind?
My first job was at the McDowell branch of the Akron Public Library in Ohio, and I got to shelve all the books. So I learned the Dewey Decimal System almost by heart, but there is some advantage to that because, when you have to go to the library, you go to the place where you like to go the best, which for me was the 900s and the geography and history. But that shelving would require you to shelve everything. And I wasn't much for fiction, but I'd have to know that as well. But that was my first job, and I can't recall what I made. But it was a little more than what you were paid, Vernon, but not much more.
What I will share too is I remember my first job at the pizza oven. That paid $2.10, and that was the minimum wage, and that's where you started. And after 3 months, I think they sort of reviewed your performance, and then you would get a raise to $2.25 an hour. And that was right about the time that gas was about $1 a gallon. That's just something I can remember. And then the other thing was working on that Christmas tree farm. That was a little different because it was farm labor, and you had to get in the back of this pickup truck and drive up there. And there you got paid cash money. And so the supervisor, he had a roll or a stack of $20 bills. So they picked you up before dawn. You rode in that truck for about 40 minutes up to where the farm was. You worked a good solid more than 8 hours, but there were a couple breaks in there, and they fed you lunch and they fed you breakfast, and they got you home, and you were exhausted at the end of that day, and you got a clean, crisp $20 bill. And to Vernon's point, you usually were too tired on that Saturday evening to go out and spend it.
That's right.
Because you'd worked all day. And it's always interesting.
Well, you did mention that first job gave you some pocket money to go to college with. And, as we started in this podcast, we're really proud that FAU does such a good job with minority students, Hispanic, African American, and others, upward mobility. When I read your autobiography, I was really struck by the passages in there about the specific actions that you took to help minority students during a time and a place when most people wouldn't do that. And you had indeed faced backlash. And I wonder if you could share a story.
Sure. And that would have been when I was at the University of Kansas. I was I graduated from Caltech in 1949, and I'd gotten interested in economics. So I decided to go back to Kansas and to the university at Lawrence and work for a master's degree in economics. And I figured then that would enable me to decide whether I wanted to go on in economics. So I arrived in Lawrence, and of course, I don't have much money. It's important to save money. Tuition was low, but you still have living expenses. Well, the University of Kansas had a very active cooperative, what we call cooperative house program. And these it wasn't really run by the university. In fact, there was a great benefit to the university because the university at the time, it's hard to believe for anyone to believe this at the time, but the University of Kansas, the campus facilities on campus were reserved for students of the Caucasian race. That's in black and white. I'm sure if it had been challenged, it would have not been constitutional under the Kansas, because Kansas had a good constitution. But there was simply widespread discrimination, and everybody looked the other way. So the fraternities were not interracial, okay? But there was this cooperative movement, and there were 5 student houses, and these were all I lived in a co-op house that had 17 undergraduates and a few graduates, 17 altogether. And we did, for $35 a month, that paid room, board, laundry facilities, and also I brewed about every 5 days. I had a 20-gallon crock, and I made beer. I learned to make home brew, and I still know how to make home brew as a result of that experience. And it was just a boom for many of us, and then I married while I was there, and we started the couples co-op, and that was the first married couples co-op on campus. And we were all the houses were interracial. And there were precious few Hispanics or blacks at the University of Kansas at that time. And they either lived at home or they lived in one of the co-op houses. So I had Hispanic housemates in the very first co-op house I was in. And then we started the couples co-op, and we rented a big house, and the top floor was we didn't need. And so the Graduate Girls Co-op, isn't that significant? It was called the Girls Co-op. You wouldn't say that today. They moved in, and there was one African American black woman that was in that group, and that right away we started having trouble with our next door neighbor over that one. But we just hung tight, because they couldn't do anything about it. There might be complaints, but so it was I was there 3 years, and that movement was, there was actually a lot of interesting students came out of that movement. I knew one guy in political science that went on to Johns Hopkins University, and I had a housemate in the first co-op that went to Harvard ahead of me, and he became a Russian economics specialist. He took a master's at Harvard in the Russian program, and then got his PhD in economics. Went back, was head of the department of University of Indiana. So it was just a very vibrant group, and these were all talk about first time. And they were just barely hanging on in some cases, meeting expenses.
That's what impressed me, because in your autobiography, you wrote about how you and the others in here scholarshiped fully a blind African-American student named Beulah for $35 a month. You each paid that, and that was room, board, and utilities, and that you ended up paying for her because, as you said, she had no place to live, and she couldn't come to the university unless she had a place to stay on campus.
Yes, and the university, you see, they had this, they're the ones that asked if we would take Beulah, because he said she's applied and she has to live close, and we can't take her. So we said, sure. Well, we decided it was kind of you see, in a way, we're lashing back. We said, we're not only going to take her, we're going to absorb the costs. You see, it was a way of our kind of twisting the lion's tail. And Beulah was with us for over a year, and I think it was 2 years. So that, and the co-op houses were just regularly filling a big need there.
Right. Well, you've sort of touched a little bit on your undergraduate and your graduate school journey. Can you come back and fill in for us some of those details a little bit? How you made that transition, went to college first, and then to...
Yes, I'll be glad to do that. I was destined to go to college. I wanted to. My parents wanted me to. And I'd been really quite an outstanding student all through grade school up through grade 8. High school, I fell behind. So now I'm a pretty mediocre high school student in terms of grades. So, and by that I mean I'm kind of C+, okay? And, where should I go to college? Well, I didn't have anyone in the family that could advise me how you choose a college, and I got a book out of the Wichita Public Library. And one of the things I read in that book, that the best undergraduate college in the United States for science and engineering was Caltech. So I thought, well, I'll just go there. As if, that would be easy, because I was completely naive about this sort of thing, So I thought, well, if I'm going to get in, I have to pass really quite tough entrance exams. That Caltech in those days, they wrote their own exams. They didn't use anyone else's exams, and no standard stuff. So I decided to go to a local small college, Friends University, a small Quaker college. It would have only had a few hundred students at the time, because this is 1944, 45. you see. So it's the war are winding down, but you don't have the veterans back really yet. So I went to France, and was that a good decision? Because it was a good university, the good teachers in physics, chemistry, mathematics. I took a course in astronomy from Dr. Reagan, who was the mathematics teacher, because he occasionally offered that, and there was a group of us that said we want to take that course, and so there was enough to make a class. So then I took the entrance exam at Caltech at the end of that first year and passed them, and it was Friends University that made that possible.
So then you went to Caltech, and what was your degree in there?
Yes, so I went to Caltech, and that's where I really learned to work, because it's almost no one can get by on native intelligence. Mm-hmm. There, you have to do some work, and I had to do a lot because there was plenty of people there smarter than I was. But it was it was an experience with high satisfaction. I really felt that was had been a good place to go, even though I decided later to go into economics. Got interested in economics as a senior because I took a principles class. They didn't teach principles until the senior year at Caltech. I'd taken a lot of history and other courses, mostly history, because they had some very distinguished historians that would visit Caltech, partly because the Huntington Library was nearby, and they were doing research in that library. So we would have someone teaching a small seminar with 6 or 7 undergraduates. Well, I would take those. So I did that, but then I took this economics class, and I got really interested in that. And I wondered, I just had no idea that something like economics existed, and there was, and it had all this kind of logic to it, you see, and here it was it was a social, not a physical science. And I remember going to the library, Caltech library, to see if I could find any books on that written by economists. And I found a book by Paul Samuelson called The Foundations of Economics. So I checked that out and looked through it. I said, well, this is just physics. So anyway, that was those years were great ones, and then I came back to Kansas, and that started so I was there 3 years, got a master's degree, and taught it at the University of Kansas before I went on to Harvard.
Yep, went to Harvard and got your PhD.
Yeah.
Who directed your dissertation work?
Vasily Leontiev was my major professor there, and
Very
he
nice.
was, and Leontiev, Hobler. I took courses from there. And also America's best known Keynesian economist at that time, Alvin Hansen. Mm-hmm. And I took macroeconomics from graduate macro, and also monetary economics from Alvin Hansen.
Yeah, great.
Could I ask you about your years, especially as a junior faculty? One thing that's impressed me about your work, and Ronald Coase said the same thing to me, that you were able to build on your research through your teaching in the classroom.
Yes.
And the experiments that you led, because a lot of faculty think that, or may think that, teaching distracts from research. But could you talk about how you use the classroom to inform your research?
For one thing, the first experiment I did was with my class. No one would have imagined you had to have a laboratory yet. So I used my classes and also colleagues' classes to run the supply and demand experiments, the first ones that I conducted, and those really completely changed. I think ended up defining my career direction, and because the first thing I discovered in these experiments is that sophomores can walk into a room. You can structure the values of the buyers and the costs of sellers so as to create a supply and demand in the laboratory, although they don't know that. They don't understand that. But they're motivated. Buyers are motivated to buy low because they profit from the difference between the value I assign them in the experiment and the price that they pay from some seller in the experiment. And then the sellers, I do the opposite. I give them a cost value, and they profit by selling at a price above that. And so each has only his own private information, knows nothing about any of the others. And in those days, one believed that environment the supply and demand wouldn't work. And here it worked. It not only worked, it was easy. And I soon disabused myself of the idea that it was an accident of the first experiment. I ran more. So now you start seeing the value of replication and changing the conditions because you think the first set of conditions were special and that explained the result. Well, it turns out that what didn't explain the result. What explained it was the law of supply and demand. And so that really, and I did a lot of variations on that, including giving everyone complete information on supply and demand. And guess what? It converged more slowly. People can identify better things in the market. For one, it was an environment where most of the surplus in equilibrium went to the buyers and none to the sellers. Mm-hmm. Well, the sellers would try to hold the price up. And they were now, you see, brought together by a common purpose that the buyers were making all the money. But all it did was slow it down. It didn't keep it from converging. So you see, it was just the opposite of what we had observed earlier. Those markets actually work quite well with completely private information.
Yeah, and that's really an important finding because as we think about how markets organize behavior and bring together buyers and sellers, there are some that claim that markets don't really work very well. And the key insight from economics is that these forces of supply and demand, if you really understand them, they really explain a tremendous amount of economic behavior. And you can just see that and have good applications of supply and demand in the world all around us. But you've also done some work that kind of shows where in certain kinds of asset markets, particularly supply and demand, can lead to disruptions.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that, where they don't function quite as smoothly as they do in most
exactly.
of the economy.
You need, and these two kinds of experiments, you see, they tend to dramatize something very special about these supply and demand experiments, and that these experiments are about final consumer demand goods. I mean, not what in the macro accounts we call non-durable goods and services. And so, and of course, food and clothing and all of these things are part of the kind of the non-durables. The durables are mostly things like furniture, appliances, automobiles, and more than anything, housing. You see, that's the long-lived by far the most long-lived good. And so they're highly durable. Well, but you see, most of the ordinary retail markets we deal in every day, nobody buys for resale. You don't buy a hamburger, you don't buy a haircut, you don't rent a hotel room to resell it or re-rent it. You do it to use it. And what the laboratory experiments show is that those markets are very quick. People can easily find the supply-demand equilibrium in those. Even in more rigid pricing systems like where sellers just post offers, the mechanism of discounting and competition is a little different. And because you see, how do retail stores, department stores, correct their errors in pricing? They have an end-of-month clearance, okay, or a summer clearance. Mm-hmm. You see, the first mass retailers were F.W. Woolworth, mm-hmm. R.H. Macy, and Sears Roebuck. They revolutionized retailing about, this would have been about 1870 or 80. They're coming in. And you see, before that, you had the general store. Basically, everything was negotiated in a general store because the owner operated it, you see. Yeah. So if you were buying a lot of different things and for the whole family, well, you could bargain a discount, you see. Well, but in New Woolworth and the department stores, you've got low-cost clerks to vend the goods. You can't depend upon them to negotiate price. So you had this fixed price policies coming in, you see. And the evidence that they make mistakes is in the fact they have to move the goods out with discounts. Sears Roebuck would have a regular discount catalog come out twice a year.
Yep.
For that. And of course they're printing the prices in the major catalog, and so they can't easily change them. So it's interesting. You see, that was but they're still competitive. It's just they're slower moving, and the mechanisms for competition started to change institutionally, and so I think that's an interesting, and that shows up in the laboratory because people. It takes somewhat longer for those posted offer markets to converge, but they still come to the competitive equilibrium.
Sure, and that's likely consistent, I think, with profit maximizing behavior because the penalties for pricing too low are that you sell out too quickly and then you have all those foregone profits. Whereas if you set prices a little too high, you can have that end of the month clearance. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But it's a really interesting point because we have all these individual buyers and sellers, and so you have the essence of competition, right? You have an assortment of prices that are out there, and then buyers can choose from those different sellers, and so the markets become efficient over time. But at any given point in time, markets are probably not in equilibrium. There's this disequilibrium and this movement toward the process of price discovery and all the rest. That's really interesting stuff. You talked a little bit earlier, I think, about the formation of bubbles in some asset markets, and particularly in the stock market and in real estate markets. Can you talk a little bit about how you discovered some of those conditions?
Yeah. Now these are products that are retraded.
Right.
That's
the
these are, and that's the important distinction over the supply and demand, non-durable stuff, and so we started in, it was 25 years after my first experiment that we started, people I was working with, co-authors, got interested in studying asset pricing. And so, and particularly we were interested in seeing if we could create bubbles in the laboratory, okay? That was sort of our idea. Turned out to be kind of naive, is it? We didn't know what we didn't know. You see, you never know what you don't know when you start to do. That's the big thing in research is maybe you're like that very first supply and demand experiment. Right away was shooting down everything I thought. I just didn't know that anything like that was possible. Well, it was the same thing with the asset trading. We thought, well, let's begin with a very transparent environment, one in which people get endowments of shares and cash, and they're going to trade an asset that will a dividend will be paid at the end of each period, and they will know what the different dividends could be and their chances of occurring. So, and we compute the expected dividend to them. So and it's a finite horizon model. They were going to trade for 15 periods, and so you're going to get 15 draws from this dividend distribution. So that meant that the fundamental value would fall because there's fewer draws left. First period, you're trading a security that's looking for 15 draws from that distribution, okay? After the end of the first period, there's just 14, and so on. So it's going to decline in value. So we explain this to the subjects, and we even compute it for them and remind them at the end of each period that next period there's only 10 periods left, so the fundamental value is 10 times 24 cents is $2.40. So we're doing all that. And so what's interesting, they pay no attention to that. They are doing, and we were absolutely amazed. Yes, right from the beginning, that markets tend to start out trading below fundamental value, rising, fundamental value is falling, and then they go through that, bust through that, and peak out and crash sometime between about period 12 and period 15. That's inexperienced subjects. Bring them back. Okay. Now, it's interesting. We still get a bubble, but there's not as big a volume. There's not as many people, believers in this. Bring them back a third time, and now the volume draw is much less, and it's trading much closer to fundamental value, so that they get there by experience, but not, you see, by this abstract notion that this is the fundamental value and everyone should trade at that. And they right away, the very first trade is below the equilibrium, you see, and of course a lot of buyers in there now buying, and so we get momentum in that market, and we eventually, if you can model it in terms of kind of fundamental traders versus momentum traders, and you can generate theoretical models, differential equations models that give you that. But with that environment, we went on to, the first thing we wanted to know was, is this just undergraduates? Okay. Early on, we'd done supply and demand with business people and other people outside of the undergraduate population. So that's one of the first things we did with the asset trading. And it turns out to be business people, corporate executives. I went to a finance conference, people there from the industry as well as universities. Ran an experiment with a group of them, and we got a nice bubble.
So,
in a way, they were kind of baffled.
That is sort of interesting. So you got the similar results with the business peoples, the entrepreneurs, and the undergraduates, right? Huh?
And we introduced then from there that original just cash versus share. We introduced margin buying, short selling, and we found that when you added those, you better have a little more sophisticated traders, because some of them really did badly.
Mm.
Did
Interesting.
very badly. And you see if they lose much, well, the question is, I can't make them pay. You see, I've endowed them, but suppose they lose all their endowment.
Yeah, there's a limit to their.
See, and actually, when the endowment starts, when they're realizing that, then they get very risky.
Oh, really?
Because they're trying to get back in the game.
Trying to get back, not worried about losing the last little bit.
No. Well, because it's now it's the experimenter's money. It's not theirs.
Right. It's OPM, other people's money.
Yeah. So you get the behavior you would expect.
And isn't that interesting? Well, it's also fascinating. We happen to be recording this on a day where this coronavirus is having some more effects in a particular asset market, the stock market. And it's both horrifying and very interesting to watch this sort of real shock propagate through the economy, through the stock market, which will then have this wealth effect and will affect people's consumptions. You have a real shock because you actually have a new virus, and then you have this perception through the news markets. And you actually have some places that are shut down in China, supplying products, being shut down now. Other production facilities in Europe, and some places now in the United States. So there are these real effects, but then there are also these psychological effects and this propagation through these asset markets. I'd rather these experiments just occurred in your laboratory, Professor Smith, than in the real world. But do you have any comments on sort of the current events?
Well, of course, that's an area where the ordinary supply and demand markets are having troubles.
Yes.
Because there's shipping. Ships are not docking with containers in ports like they were for a while. So you're having a disruption of the supply chains that normally they run very smoothly, all coordinated by prices without anyone. No one needs to be in charge. No, it's the way I'd put it is no single person is charged, but everybody is in charge. That is, everyone's involved in the market is making that work. Well, now you have kind of everybody stepping back. They're trying to avoid the transmission of that virus. So it's just really quite devastating. And now you really see the function of the pricing system and how smooth it is. It goes without even having to worry about it most of the time. And now all of a sudden, we're not even sure that there'll be enough of some foods delivered or harvested or manufactured, whatever the product is.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping that we'll look back on this podcast 6 months from now and talk about the shortness and temporary nature of this disruption. But we have no way of knowing that at the moment. Let's shift gears just a little bit. You've been over your lifetime a great advocate for free market economics and the free market economic system. And been involved in research along those ways. Can you tell us how you come to that sort of view and the experience of, and comment briefly on this capitalism versus socialism debate that's going on?
It's important to know that I didn't begin there. My mother was a socialist.
Okay.
In fact, a lot of the people I knew growing up in the 30s were very strong. They had been supporters of the American Socialist Party, Eugene Victor Debs, and then later Norman Thomas. My grandfather defected to Roosevelt, you see. And so that was very much in the family. And that probably was one of the things that drew me to economics, too. Because I hadn't realized that economics there was actually some rigor here. When I took a principles class, it wasn't just all a matter of getting the distribution solved. Because people in those days, the socialists said that, we solved the problem of production, but we have a problem of distribution, thinking that these were unconnected with each other. But you see, the study of economics started to change that but not so dramatically until I ran that first experiment. You see, that was the real turning point, because lots of people, including economists, question how effective markets are. And I had a completely contrary result. And moreover, although some would dismiss it because, well, it's just the laboratory or something, wasn't the real world. But I knew, you see, that, listen, if there's anything to this, the arguments that people have made, then this shouldn't work in the lab. And it is working, you see. And people with completely private, decentralized, dispersed information can, through a market, multilateral, competitive process, can find the equilibrium of us. And I didn't only look at static equilibrium. I would take growing demand, and I looked at tracking, and some of the early exercises involved a lot of variations besides that simple supply and demand. And then it turned out, by the time then we got to the 80s, and there was interest in deregulating. In the United States, there was a lot of interest in deregulating the gas industry and freeing up the pipelines from. And the old Federal Power Commission, you see, the wholesale buyers of gas at the city gates had to buy it from the pipeline that brought it in. They couldn't separately contract for gas in the gas fields and the transportation. It all came in, and that was government regulation. That was the way, because it was actually believed that the market couldn't do that. Literally, people believed the market couldn't do that. It was called bundling. The gas needs to be bundled with the transportation for it to be done right. Well, we ran experiments where all of that there were pipeline owners who were specifying offers of transportation capacity on the individual legs in a pipeline network. There were wholesale buyers that were putting in bid functions to buy delivered gas. And then there were gas producers that were putting in supply functions. And they made and that was one of our first, what we call smart computer-assisted markets, where if all of these agents are putting in these level step functions, you can just, when they put the functions in, you run a linear program and get the prices, you see. And so that was our first, and then later that was done entirely, though, decentralized, without any computer assistance. Let people just, so we looked at both what we call smart computer assisted markets and ones where people were kind of doing it by the seat of their pants. And those, it speeded up with the smarts, you see, but still people could do it. It might take longer, and there's maybe more money lost in the process. But so that got us into, and also electric power.
Yeah.
We got interested and started to do electric power experiments. And so we were then in demand. And we went to New Zealand, Australia. I spent some time in Chile, also Argentina, because these were countries that were all moving from a government-owned electric power industry to a potential liberalized one. And one of the first ones that we were involved, the two first ones were New Zealand and Australia. And in fact, Australia just, they moved really remarkably fast within about 3 years from essentially experiments in the laboratory trading power to experiments trading power on their grid. I mean, it was actually moved into the field. And that's where I learned how if you're going to make a market in something that people never made a market in, and it was complex and it was controversial, the lab was perfect for this. And also it could serve as a training tool, you see, to help to facilitate the... So that was the, that really went a substantial, and in fact, we still do some of that work. But the asset trading, that is, it turned out so robust that inexperienced subjects will bubble, that all kinds of people have gotten into that do laboratory experiments, and can't even keep up with it. There's so many different variations.
Well, I remember hearing this story you told at dinner with you and Charlie Plott, another very fine economist who I think is still at Caltech.
Yeah.
And the two of you had been running some experiments, and I believe had co-authored some work. But in this case, you were just a couple of guys in a raft floating down the Colorado River, camping and catching trout for dinner. And I remember thinking, I wonder if that river guide knew what key economists he had in his raft, and hoped he didn't, and was glad he didn't lose either of you overboard, and that. So that's great. Let me ask one more, because we've talked a little bit about markets and where markets work, prices and all that stuff. You talked a little bit in the class about socialism and how the socialism has these fundamental problems and it hasn't worked. When you see socialism that's actually tried, what kind of results do we observe?
Well, I think probably the closest to being a natural experiment would be North Korea and South Korea. Because North and South Korea, it's the same history, the same language, the same culture, for I don't know how many hundreds and maybe thousands of years.
Yeah.
And then we have this split. And of course, I'm sure you've all seen the satellite pictures from the night sky, and you look at North Korea is dark and South Korea is brilliant with lights, and that tells you all you need to know. There's all kinds of activity. There's wealth being produced in South Korea. And the North Koreans are having a great deal of trouble feeding themselves, quite literally. And you see the same thing in Venezuela. You had there kind of a benevolent dictator. He got in by democratic process. And Venezuela, which has it's the richest country in the world in terms of oil reserves, petroleum reserves. The Venezuelan government nationalized the oil industry, you see. So, and they took over that means they're taking over the production of oil and also the exploration, because there's a lot more oil discovering possibilities in Venezuela. Well, that's been a disaster. This idea, the socialist idea that anyone can run a business, and the government easily does it. The government is not good at running things. And if you need to remember that the U.S. government, almost all of its goods and services are bought from the private sector. The U.S. government does not yet try to build its own tanks and airplanes. Well, thank goodness for heaven they don't, because you see, and where do we see direct government operation of what would normally be private facilities? Well, the veterans' hospitals, as an example. And they're just, corruption, all kinds of they've now tried to clean it up, and veterans now have a choice, as I understand it, between taking their benefits in a veterans hospital or in the private sector. But creating a monopoly for a particular group that the government's paying for, they can't deliver the product. And of course, the other place where our government is very heavily involved is in the education. And it's okay for the government to pay for it. It's not okay for them to try to run it.
Thank you. This is one of the things I enjoy so much about talking with you. Today, you're 93 years, 2 months, and 4 days old. And what I always enjoy are the vignettes that you have, for example, from the 1930s, when your mother and many others were socialists. And now, 90 years later, we see the same. And as you just explained, over this time, you grew up on a Kansas farm, really, after the Great Depression and the various economic cycles. I want to take you to another point in time, another namesake, Adam Smith, and wanted to ask you, what lessons do we have from Adam Smith, who wrote several hundred years ago about business ethics and markets?
Yes. Well, of course, Smith is best known for writing The Wealth of Nations. And that was published in the marvelous year of 1776.
Yes, yes.
But he published in 1759 The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And that book is, I would say it's a work in social psychology, really. It's about human sociability and how that sociability comes out of our natural sentiments of fellow feeling. We have this built-in capacity for fellow feeling with others, and that starts in the family, and then the extended family, neighbors, acquaintances, friends, and goes out. And what's especially interesting is that in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith says we are all strictly self-interested. Now that's hard for an economist to understand because everybody's strictly self-interested, but we're other regarding when dealing with people in our social groupings and neighborhoods and communities. And I think it's a powerful model whereby he gets there. And it's entirely a matter of learning to follow rules and having this capacity for fellow feeling. You see, that does that. And Smith says that starts when we first have playfellows. And says the first thing that we learn is that our playfellows are not as indulgent as our parents if we do things they don't like. And it's marvelous. It's beautifully written, too. And he says, this is when we enter the great school of self-command, starting playfellows. So he has this, I think, a really important concept of self-command, that this is driven from inside, not outside. And we are rule followers because we're committed to each other in this following behavior. And we, in a way, we respect each other's property, our rights to take action, you see. And that grows, and I think his propositions on beneficence move gradually into the economics and trade. Now, he doesn't do that. The Wealth of Nations, he never cites the Theory of Moral Sentiments in the Wealth of Nations. You don't. In those days, you didn't you didn't cite yourself. It was, bad form. But the thing is, you have the concept of gains from trade really coming from the propositions on beneficence concerning human social, because you get reciprocity, you see, in social groups, and that lends itself naturally to that principle to trade. And then justice was about it's about one thing only: security from injury. That's Smith's thought. If you read his lectures on jurisprudence, justice is all about security from. It has nothing. See, something like distributional justice would be a contradiction of terms. Smith would say, well, distribution, that has to do with beneficence. Justice is about limiting and controlling the extent to which people deliberately injure each other, intentionally injure. So it's about limiting intentional injury. And so very early we had communities that sympathized with the victims of murder, the victims of theft and robbery. Their sympathy with the victim led them to support the victim's desire to avenge those actions. Now, Smith argues that in early communities before governments are very strong, kind of think of tribal communities where the government is, there is kind of weak forms of government. He said these kinds of injuries were solved by compensation or the potential for compensation. So if somebody was killed in this family and it was due to a person in this family did it, then this person was taken to the head of this family. And well, what's to happen here? Well, sometimes death penalty, but often something would be worked out and it'd be compensation. You'd work for them or something like that, you see. And then he said, but then when government became more complex and society much more, and is less intimate, then these unjust acts became crimes against the public, and you had only punishment. Now, violation of contract, though, remained a civil infraction, and their compensation, you see, comes in. So Smith asks, so now why is the penalty for violation of contract smaller than the penalty for theft and robbery, even if it's the same amount? He said, well, because theft and robbery takes us from us stuff that we've already acquired. The violation of contract, he says, just frustrates our expectation of gain, and so people don't see that as bad. But of course, it's still, if you can get you can go to the law, and there's procedures for being compensated, you see, for doing that. But it's a civil infraction, not a criminal one. So it's a great book because it's he kind of tells you through these two pillars of society, beneficence and justice. He's able to explain a lot of the things that's part of our daily life in our communities, and why when the rule of law comes into governments, they're just barring on the rules people have already been following.
Interesting. Yeah, that gives us a sort of a different insight, perhaps, into what business ethics might perhaps be talking about and be taught in our schools, rather than sort of the more compliance-based view that you quite often see in these courses. So that'll be an interesting takeaway that we'll work on long after your visit is past, I think, here. All right, so for both Siri and myself, and on behalf of all the faculty and students in the College of Business here at Florida Atlantic University, thank you, Dr. Smith, for visiting us and being part of this podcast series.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I've enjoyed it.
To learn more about our activities and upcoming events, please see our College of Business website, business.fau.edu.
Dean Gropper Presents is part of the FAU College of Business Podcast Network. To learn more, visit us at business.fau.edu/podcasts and follow Dean Gropper on Twitter at FAU Business Dean.